Hi everyone. So I'm from INSYDIUM and we make X-Particles and Cycles 4D, which are plugins that help you make and render amazing stuff inside Maxon Cinema 4D. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with our visual effects showreel. Now this isn't actually what we're going to concentrate on today, but this just gives you a flavour of what can be created. Everything here is simulated in X-Particles and rendered in Cycles 4D. So that's made by our incredibly talented head of design, Mario Tranfuck, and it showcases the visual effects tools that have been brought into X-Particles over the last kind of 2-3 years of development. And it looks stunning. We've got fluids, we've got fire, we've got grains, all kinds of cool stuff. But in our everyday work as artists, often we don't have the luxury of doing these huge visual effects projects. We don't get to make a massive ocean with foam and spray and splashes, or make mushroom cloud nuclear explosions. We do motion graphics for real world clients. So today what I'm going to demonstrate is how we can apply the whole X-Particles toolkit to specifically motion graphics projects and more everyday productions, which will really make your work pop. And I'm going to show you how easy it is to set up and how it is all integrated, and then how we can make it look pretty using Cycles 4D. So in preparation I asked Mario to create a motion graphics based render for IBC. And there weren't many stipulations I said to him, but what I said was, use everything. Use everything that X-Particles has got and make sure that it's all combined and it's all working really well. And this is what he's come up with. Now, I've watched this about 50 times. I know how it works and I still can't get my head around it. So here we go. This was sent to me, it finished rendering last night at 11:58 PM. So it really is new. And so we've got this really nice motion graphics countdown. So we pick numbers for a countdown for whatever it may be, but obviously it could be animated text, it could be logo morphs, it could be any kind of motion graphics project that you may have to do. So just to let that sink in, because it twisted my mind, I'll play it one more time before we get started. Beautiful stuff. Right, so I've only got, less than an hour now, so I'm not going to be able to break down every single number transition. But we'll jump into it, we'll recreate some of these scenes, and we'll see how far along we can get. So let's go into Cinema 4D. We are in R21, the latest release. So what we're going to do, we're going to start with that really nice shrink wrap. So we've got that plastic, and it shrinks around that number before it is burnt away. So what we're going to do, let's bring in a cube. We're going to build our bag first. Oh, I'm in the wrong view. Where am I? There we go. Perspective. So here's a cube. We need to subdivide this cube. And let's press ND to see the lines. Oh, not in there though. Subdivide it and then press ND. So we have given it some segments, because we're going to be deforming this into our bag. So whenever you're deforming geometry, you need polygons. The more polygons you have, the sweeter and smoother and detailed that deformation is, but it'll take longer to calculate. So this is quite low resolution here, but I'll be able to do it in real time in front of you. So I'm going to take most of the depth away from that cube, and this is going to be my shrink wrap bag. But first of all, we need a bulge, because we need our letter to fit within the volume. So we'll just use a deformer for that. So I'm going to hold Shift, go to our Cinema 4D deformers, which are fantastic, and I'm going to pick the FFD deformer, which automatically makes it a child of this cube. And what this does is, if you haven't seen this one before, I'm just going to increase the size so you can see. It makes a cage around your geo with these control points which can be selected. And you can really stretch and deform this quite aggressively, and you get this fantastically smooth and even deformation of this geo. So if you are an horrendous modeler like I am, Cinema 4D deformers save me every single time. So let's just undo that. I'm going to take away all of that depth. That's just fit to parent again. So what I'm going to do is select the middle, let's take that away, select these middle 2 points, hit the T key to scale, and we're just going to scale these up, and what you see is we're going to create this nice bulge in the middle of our bag, which gives us the volume to hide the letter. And look how clean that is, it's fantastic. So that's our geo. So I'm going to select the cube, right click, and let's just do current state to object, and I'll just delete that parametric one. In production you wouldn't, obviously, but for this that's fine. And I'm left with a polygon object which is beautifully deformed. Right, so that's our bag. Now we need this to shrink into our letter or number or whatever. So we'll go to MoGraph, let's build that, we'll get a Mo text, there it is, and let's just make it a number 5 like in Mario's render. Let's go to the cube, just going to go to X-ray mode so we can see inside it. And I'm not going to concentrate too much on the font, I'm just going to make that a bolder one. Let's just resize it down a wee bit, 150, maybe make it slightly deeper, and move it into the middle of our bag. There we go. And I should use the orthographic views, but I'm too lazy, so I'm going to eyeball it. So there it is, hiding in the middle of our bag. So what we need to do now is turn that into kind of a physics object and have it suck in around that number. So the way we're going to do that, there's several ways we could, but we're going to use XParticles cloth, which allows you to get any bit of geometry and turn it into a cloth object, which we can then manipulate. So the way I'll do that, I'm going to highlight the cube, I'm going to go to my XParticles menu, and we'll go to Dynamic Objects, Cloth, Create Cloth. Click on that, and loads of stuff comes into the Object Manager automatically for us, and it is automatically set up a cloth system, which is going to make our shrink wrap bag behave like cloth. So we don't need the gravity, because we're not actually going to use gravity in this scene. That's coming automatically. Let's get rid of that, delete. And I'm just going to switch the constraints off for now. That came in as well. So what's happened is, this XParticles emitter has come in. I'm just going to change the display to circles. And what happens is, it spawns a particle on every vertex of our geometry, right? And then those particles are bound together with invisible constraints, which we can adjust, and then they are solved by this cloth modifier. And wherever those particles move, they will drag the vertices of our geometry along with it, giving the illusion that it's turned into cloth. So that will make sense when I do the next little stage. So if I just bring in an XParticles turbulence modifier, this turbulence is going to affect those particles. The cloth constraints are going to hold them together, and it's going to waft around the place. Let's just reduce that strength a little bit. So the particles are moving. If I make the particles invisible, now that is acting like cloth, because the particles are moving, they're constrained, and then they're deforming our geometry along with it. So that's kind of halfway there, but it's not what we want yet. So let's get rid of the turbulence. We want to suck it in towards our 5. So we're going to make a custom force field. And the way we're going to do that is go to our dynamic object, and it is our flow field object. So what this brings in is this bounding box with these arrows, and this is creating a custom force field. And by default, it is set to a directional force in the plus z axis. You can see the arrows are all pointing in that way. So because our particles have no speed, they're not moving, so they can't follow a direction because they've got no speed. They don't know how fast to go in that direction. They have 0 speed, so they're standing still. So if we just change that from a directional field to a velocity field, suddenly they get fired backwards, and the cloth follows. So that's obviously not what we want either. But this is the cool bit. What I can do, I can use the surface normals of my text and create a velocity field in that direction, invert them, so all those arrows are pointing towards the geometry. So let me just do that quickly. It sounds more complex than it actually is. Let's go to my flow field. Just going to increase the resolution. So I'm going to set the flow away from the default, which is in the Z direction. I'm going to change it to surface normal. And then it asks for an object. Which normals do you want to use? So I'm going to drag in my mode text, which is my number 5. And now if I just increase that fall off, can you see that all those arrows are pointing away from the surface of our geometry? So if I just invert those, now they're pointing towards the surface of the geometry. I'm just going to make it invisible because it'll play a bit quicker. And I'll just reduce the speed. We don't need this much speed, so reduce that velocity. And we're almost going to be there now. Well, bit disappointing. What's wrong? Couple of things. We need to put a collider tag on the 5 so the particles can't penetrate it, obviously. So let's get that sorted out. Mode text, tags, X particles tags, collider. And I'll just take the bounce and put some friction on. And we need to give this flow field a helping hand. It's given the particles the velocity. It's trying to give them that direction, but we kind of need to multiply that directional force now. So the way we'll do that, we can just layer these up. So I'm going to copy the flow fields. Let's hold Control, drag it down, and in the copy, it's exactly the same, but I'm going to change it from velocity to direction. I'm going to whack up that strength, and now I think we should get something that's starting to look a little bit better. Right, we've got this under control now. Now it's not shrinking, is it? And this is because the constraints on our cloth are set to be too rigid. The cloth is like a heavy velvet. It's not crumpling in on itself. So let's change that. So the controls for that are in the cloth tag that sits on our geo. So let's just highlight that, go to cloth. And all we need to do is this. Whenever you have a physics simulation using particles, iterations per frame, if there are more of them, it makes the simulation more rigid feeling. And this goes for fluids, for cloth, anything. It makes it constrained, it makes it much more rigid. If you reduce the iterations, it makes it much more floppy. So let's reduce it down to, say, 4. And I'm just going to, these are the strength of the constraints, which are, if you imagine lines between the particles. Let's just put those down. So now we should have a really nice shrinking. And it's coming around, so we're getting there. So we've got some pretty horrible Phong problems here. So let's go to our cube, to the Phong tag, and just put this Phong angle up to the max, which is going to smooth that out. So the last stage is we are getting, I'm not sure if you can see, but we're getting some intersections. You see how this cloth has intersected itself? So how do we stop that? Well, when we first brought in the cloth system, it brought this constraints object in for us, which I deactivated because it would run quicker. So I'm going to switch that on, and in this constraints system, it has particle-to-particle collisions active. So it's going to stop the cloth particles from intersecting themselves, and because it stopped the particles intersecting themselves, the cloth that is being deformed by the particles won't intersect themselves either. So let's have a look. There we go. Fantastic. So I've done this at really low resolution so I can do it in front of you live. You would want to do loads more subdivisions, more particles, and it'd make it more detailed. But if you're pushed and your render doesn't need that high resolution, you can just do the subdivision surface trick. If I take my cube, hold Alt, and stick it in a subdivision surface, look how smooth out it makes it instantly. And because the cloth is working on the low poly version, it actually simulates quite quickly as well. Look, so this is all happening in real time. Pretty cool. All right, so that's our shrink wrap round the 5. So what I want to do is just show you, I've got virtually the same scene here, and I've cached it. So we've got a cache tag here. So this is like the XParticles way of baking your simulation once you're happy with it. So now, because it's cached it, I can scrub, right? So I'm just going to retime it, because if you remember the, let's go to this. If you have a look at how it deforms, it starts slow and it snaps in, right? And that snap is really important for the feel. So we're going to do that by retiming the cache, not faffing around with the simulation, which is a real headache. Always retime if you can. So let's go back to Cinema 4D. So if I go to my cache tag, what I'm going to do is, let's have a look. So I've got hold activated, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to click this play per frame function. If I click that, it stays on frame 0, which means there's not going to be any animation. It's just frozen on frame 0. If I put it on frame 55, it'll just always be on frame 55. So we're going to retime this like you would in After Effects, the old school way. On frame 0, we're going to put a 0 keyframe. On frame 90, we're going to put a 90 keyframe. And now it's going to play as if we hadn't done anything, as if we hadn't changed it. So I'm going to find the point where I want it to go fast. So it's going to go suck in like, and then at this point I want it to go yum. So that's about there. I'm going to stick another keyframe. And then I want a little bit of movement at the end. So about there. So we've got a little bit. Another keyframe. And now all I have to do is select these last 2 keyframes, drag them back, and this section is our snap. So let's have a look. Snap. And then a bit of secondary motion to finish with. And you can obviously spend much more time getting that perfect, but now we have this retimed cache. If you now want to give a bit of like a second pre-roll before it starts, all you have to do is select all the keyframes, slide it to frame 30, and now we have it, and there it starts, retimed. Fantastic. And that is basically it for our shrink wrap. So before we move on, let me quickly show you a really quick bog standard rendering setup in Cycles 4D that'll take 20 seconds, and it'll make that look like a piece of polythene shrink wrap. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring in a plane, not even going to bring in any lights. I'm going to bring in a plane and stick it on the top. This is going to be our light. So I need a light material, and that's called an emission material in Cycles. So I'm going to go to Create, Cycles, Surface, Emission. This is a preset. Hit that, put it on my plane. So now if I open my Cycles real-time preview, straight away with one light, and it doesn't look bad. Obviously you'd light it properly for production, but we're getting this, and we can even play through the animation, and there it goes, and we're getting this pretty decent feedback. So let's take our emission, I'm going to double click it, and it opens the amazing Cycles 4D node editor, which is just an absolute joy to work with. And this emission node is just one. I'm going to increase the strength, and you see it gets lighter. I'm just leave it at that, and that's it. So now I want this to look like kind of polythene, so I'm going to go Create, Cycles 4D, Surface is extended. These are all presets, and we've got this one that you get shipped with Cycles called Glass Dispersion, which is an amazing shader. If I drag that onto my object, straight away we're getting something that looks quite polythene, but you see you get this really nice, it separates the RGB light as it kind of refracts and disperses in the surface, which is really nice. So let's just open that up, and again look, it's one node, so these presets are great, so you can just adjust those. If you want to really geek out and see how it's made, if we just look at that bad boy, that's what's happening under the hood. I tend to just close those and forget about them. Alright. So let's just add a little bit of roughness. And there we go. So really quickly, we've got our render, it creases down, and we've made it in what, 20 minutes? pretty decent. And if you set the render up a bit nicer with better lights, that's almost production ready. Awesome. Right, so relatively simple to start, but this is all about how we integrate all the other X-Particles features into existing scenes. So let's just have a look at our render. So this is the cool bit, right? I'm going to ignore those mixed fluids for now. We've got time, I'll get back to those at the end. But this is a really nice reveal, isn't it? And that could be, you could think of so many uses for that in motion graphics, in sports bumpers, logo reveals, so much cool stuff. So what is happening? It almost looks like magic, doesn't it? So there's two things going on. The cloth is tearing and disintegrating at the same rate as the fire is burning its way across that material. And we have to sync this up perfectly to get it to work. And what's fantastic about how the way in which X-Particles is unified is that we're going to guarantee that animation is going to be spot on for both the fire and the tearing. And it's because the way in which we set it up, it's impossible not to be. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to go to this frame where this has stopped animating. I'm going to take my cube, and I'm going to go current state to object, which makes this copy. I'm going to get rid of the cache tag and the cloth tag, and I'm going to get rid of that. So now we just have a still piece of geometry in that pre-distorted mode. So now we're going to set this on fire and rip it. So how do we do that? Well, it's going to sound a bit counterintuitive, but we're going to make it into cloth again, but from this point. So let's grab it, go to X-Particles, Dynamic Objects, Cloth, and create cloth. So we've just done exactly the same thing, and again it's brought in all of these elements for our cloth to work. I'm going to get rid of the gravity, we're not using gravity. So if I hit play, it's going to try and unfold itself. Let's have a look. You see it's slightly unfolding right at the beginning. Can you see it? And it's jiggling about a bit. That's because the constraints are active and they're trying to push those particles apart that are in all of those creases. So you're getting that little wiggle at the beginning. But I'm going to switch that off for now, I don't want it. Right, so here's the fun bit. Let's set it on fire first. So what we will do is, we could just go to X-Particles, Dynamic Objects, we're going to bring in an exposure, which is our smoke and fire solver. Bring it in, and it brings in this domain where the simulation takes place to make the smoke and the fire. Let's just close those in a bit and put the resolution down so it doesn't look as good, but it'll sim a bit more quickly. So what we could do, we could just get the cloth object, which is our cube, go to tags, X-Particles tags, and put an exposure effect source, and it's just going to set it on fire, and it's going to ignite. So this is a low quality preview. But of course it gives us no control over where it's firing or whether it's where it's burning. We get no growth over the item, so that's not going to work. So let's delete that. What we can also do, if I just make those, so remember the cloth always makes particles, so if I just do that so you can see the particles, what we can do, we can give these particles a fuel amount and they will be ignited by the exposure effects. So how do we do that? Well, that setting lives in the emitter settings. We've got extended data, and it's the physical data where all this happens. And look, we've got a fuel amount, so I'm just going to put one fuel in there. So every particle has got a fuel amount of 1, right? So if I then put that same exposure effects tag on the emitter and hit play, now all the particles are making the fire. But it still doesn't look any different. It's still not right. We're still not getting kind of animation. So that's still not right. So I'm going to go to my emitter and I'm going to get rid of that fuel. So what are we going to do? Well, we need to get the growth happening first. We want the fire to start on this corner and spread up this cloth. So we want some natural growth to get that transition. So the way we're going to do it, we're going to use Infectio, which allows us to infect particles, and then the particles infect surrounding ones, and it spreads organically. just like saying infectio. It's a good one. So X particles, modifiers, control, infectio. And the only thing you have to do to infect these particles, we bring in a seed object, which is this spherical volume, right? That's the seed object. And all you have to do is stick it where you want the infection to start, and any particles inside there will be infected. So if I go forward a frame, you see they've turned red? So they're infected. And now, depending on the settings that you put here, it's going to search for its surrounding particles and infect them. And the infection is going to spread and spread and spread. And we get this natural growth. So let's have a look. So it's spreading across our particles. Excellent. So we're kind of getting there. Now this isn't creating new particles. It's not doing. It's just changing the color from green to blue to red, right? But wouldn't it be cool if only the blue particles emitted fire? Then we're going to get fire emitting diagonally upwards in an organic growth. So we're going to step closer to the look that we want. So how are we going to do it? Well, I'm going to go to my emitter, and I'm going to change the birth particles and make them have a color value of 0. So they're going to be black, right? Let's just turn off that geo so we can see the particles. And then in the infectio, I'm not going to use the particle color for the incubation mode. I don't need to go into that. I'm just going to change this and do set from incubation rate. Just trust me, that's what we need to do for this scene. So now we've got black particles, and they're turning from black to blue to red. So let's just change it. We'll make the blue ones white, and the red ones will make black as well. So now we have got this growth that we want. And the cool thing about infectio is we can have as many seed objects as you want. So if I stick one up here and stick one there, that one's obviously not touching, we can get all these fantastic natural bits of growth flowing over our cloth in whichever way that we want. You can also, I'll just take those off because we only want one. You can also animate them as well. Animate the seed objects in, you put a vibrate tag on or whatever, and you can kind of actually draw where you want the infection to take place, which gives you different looks as well. So pretty versatile, but we'll just keep it there for now. All right, excellent. So let's just get back to what we want. We want these white particles to be given fuel only when they're white, which will then create fire. Make sense? Cool. So we gave the emitter the fuel via the extended data in the physical data tab. So what we want is a modifier which controls these values. So let's go to modifiers, and we can go to control, and look, we have a physical modifier. So this modifier is going to adjust those physical values. So let's do that. We don't want temperature, we want fuel. We want to change the fuel of particles. We want to set the value, and we want to give the particles a value of 1. So this on its own is going to look exactly the same as doing it in the emitter. Everything's on fire, right? So what we need to do is map that fuel value to only the white particles. So how do we do it? Well, it's pretty easy. We'll go to the mapping tab of the modifier, add a map, and the parameter that we want to map is the fuel value. There it is, and the fuel value we have set as 1. And we want to map it to not the particle age, we want to map it to the particle's color brightness. And what this graph on the bottom is saying is that the x-axis is the color brightness from 0 to 100%, and the y-axis is the parameter that you're mapping, the fuel value. So this line is saying if a particle has 0% color brightness, so is black, it has no fuel, because it has 0% of the fuel amount. And if it has 100% color brightness, it has 100% of that fuel amount, which is 1. So let's just, to be sure, just pinch those in a little bit. So if this works, we should just be getting fuel coming from the white particles. And there it's burning its way across, and it's working. The smoke's lingering around a little bit too much, but that'll look fine once we get some movement in there. So that's a basic mapping setup, which if you haven't tried mapping at first, it's a little bit complicated and it twists your mind a little, because when you get the parameter and you see all these different options, you think, oh my god, where they come from. But the more that you use it, the more it becomes self-explanatory, and it's actually a very easy technique. Right. So we need some organic movement. Where are we going to get our organic movement from? Well, we're going to use the smoke and fire to push our cloth up using its velocity, and that's called particle advection. So how do we do that? I'm going to make the exposure invisible. So let's have a look. So the exposure is happening there only with the white particles. If I go to the exposure effects, which is our smoke and fire solver, and go to advection and select this, all of these bits of data is what the exposure effects is generating when it burns fuel. And it then, if we've got advect particles selected, it passes it on into the particle. So each particle holds that data as well. So that's all advection is passing data from something to the particle. So we don't want to pass on any information apart from the velocity, because we want it to move in the same way as the smoke. So we're only going to have velocity active. So let's have a look. It's starting to move. So it's still not quite right yet, but it's moving. So what I'm going to do is, in our cloth object, remember in the other one we reduced the iterations down to make it more pliable, and we brought the strength down. So let's do that. And then we're getting this really nice organic moving, because it's moving with the fire. Now it's grabbing onto the 5 for dear life, because it's just stretching and stretching and stretching and stretching. So now we need to activate tearing of that cloth. So when particles are stressed and pulled, they then tear and it disintegrates. And that, mercifully, is really simple. So I'm just going to make the particles invisible. I'm going to make our cloth visible again. And let's just go to our cloth tag. We've got a tearing. Activate it. I'm just going to change a couple of settings. You don't really need to worry about that. So now, when those particles are stressed, they should tear. And there it disintegrates, gets pulled up, and we get this really nice motion. And what's fantastic about this, especially for logo reveals, is that it feels organic, that movement, and it perfectly matches that smoke and fire sim. So it doesn't look like a fudge, like you've just stuck on some fire in post. It really is an integral part of the scene. So let's just make it active again. So what we could do, let's just try and set up a really quick render. So what have we got so far? We have got our polythene and our number. So that's working all right. So all I'm going to do is go to create cycles. I'm going to get a volume shader, because smoke and fire is volume information. And I'm going to get this is preset. Exposure effects, fire and smoke. I'm going to stick it on there. Now this is low res, so it's not going to be the best looking smoke and fire sim, but you're going to get the idea that even with minimal lighting and just presets, we're getting a decent look. I'm just going to increase the resolution of the EFX just slightly, so we get a slightly nicer solve. And we're even going to get a preview in real time, in the real time preview. And then we're getting the burn. It's ripping that cloth. It's moving upwards, and it cleans up, and we're getting this fantastic kind of tearing scene. And it feels, when we get the full quality render of this, it just feels like it's supposed to be there, and it's organic. So just finally, for this scene, if you see on Mario's render, I watched this about 10 times, and I tried to work out, how does the 5 goo disappear and the next number be revealed underneath as the burning is happening? And I thought, it must be a mat, it must be a trick in the compositing. It's got to be. Let's have a look. And if you freeze frame it and go one by one, which I did several times, I thought, do you know what? It's not. And I couldn't work out how he did it. And it is the most simple rendering trick. And when you have kind of a renderer like Cycles that has this real-time preview, you can see these things happening in real time. And this is a compositing trick at render time. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my 5. So what is it? This mode text, and I'm going to give it what's called a Cycles 4D object tag, which is basically a compositing tag. And I've got these options. And this is what I can do. Because this is a glass material, it's a transparent object, it has transmission and it has glossy. Even if I say that the 5 can't be seen by the camera and it can't be seen by the diffuse, we still see it. And that's because the 5 is seen by the glass and it's seen by the reflections. And it just looks exactly the same. But of course, as soon as we are not looking at this through the lens of that material, it just disappears. So we'll just let it go, and as soon as it starts to rip, you'll see that by magic, it's just disappeared. And what's nice is, if you switch the fire off, you still get all the reflections of it in the torn cloth that's moving off. So it's not that it just disappears on that line, that transition. You still get the reflections of the 5 as it's being whisked away. It's almost like it's disintegrating along with the cloth. And you're getting it for free. I mean, it's just so simple. So, yeah, that's an awesome scene. Right, let's move on. So, what have we got? This one's pretty cool. Has anybody got any ideas how this is done? So we've got a 6, and suddenly it splats, forms into the shrink wrap, and then before it's even finished forming, it's already shrinking around the 5. How on earth did he do that? Well, like all of Mario's scenes, it's actually ridiculously simple. So let's have a go at doing this one. Where are we? Okay. So what I'm going to do from this scene, I'm going to borrow, what should we get? Let's borrow the text. Make a new project. And I'm going to paste that in. So this is going to be a 6 now. And what we need to do is set up this as an emitter first. So Xparticles brings in emitters, and by default you just have this rectangular emitter, and it spits particles out in the Z direction. But what we can do is we can have particles being emitted from objects as well. Anything can be an emitter. So let's go to the emitter, to the object tab, and we're going to select object. And I'm going to actually, do you know what, it's always a good idea with mode text, when you've got objects with caps, to put them in a connect object first. It makes it easier. So I'm going to hit Alt, get a connect object. Okay. So then in the emitter, I'm going to drag the connect object into the object tab. So now the particles have been emitted from the geometry. Let's just take off. I'll get rid of that for now. Okay. So there are particles emitting from the polygons of that geo. Cool. So what we need to do is, we're doing this splash. We're making this splash out of the 6. So we need it to shoot out really quickly. So let's go to the emission tab. And we'll change the emission mode from rate, which means they're coming out every second, per every frame, this number per second. And we'll put it to shot, so it just blasts out. So there's the start of our splash, which doesn't look much like a splash yet. And we want this to rebound off what will become our shrink wrap. So let's just do another cube, because it's easy. I'm just going to put our segments in like we did before, so it's the same. And let's just make it less, something like that. I'll actually make the cube invisible. We don't really need to see it at this point. So the cube, it needs to be a collision object, right? We don't want particles to go through it. So let's go to tags, Xparticles tags, collider. And this time I'm going to say, I want them to collide inside the volume. So if I hit play, there we can see they're bouncing around the place inside the cube. So let's take the bounce off, the friction up. Alright, so now we need to make this into a fluid splash. How do we do it? Well, first of all, we need to get these particles behaving in a fluid-like way. Do those particles show up on that screen? Do you know what? Let's just change the display type just so you can see them a bit better. There we go. Right, so in the emission, 1,000's probably all right. I'm going to put the size down a little bit. So we're going to change them into a fluid sim. So let's go to the dynamic objects where all the physics solvers live, and we're going to bring in a fluid effects. Now this makes them behave like fluid, but it doesn't look like fluid. It looks like a low-res mess. But this is fantastic because we're going to use one of our relatively new features to fill this splash out and make it look like a decent splash. So now we've got that working. I'm just going to change that display mode back to dots. So we're going to use our what's called a sheeter, which is another dynamic object, and the sheeter is a genius object. What it does, it looks for two fluid particles, and if they're moving away from each other and it satisfies all of the settings that you put in, it fills in the gap with new particles. So this has been a problem with fluid solvers in the past, is that they can look a bit blobby because the water spits out, the fluid solver makes some of them grab together in globules, and you don't get that thin sheeting. So the sheeter solves that problem. So what it's going to do, it's going to look at all of these particles, and where there are gaps, try and fill them in. Now I'm going to increase the density search, and we're going to start seeing, there, can we see that it's filling them in a bit? And now we're getting a bit more of a splash. How does it show? Doesn't show up well, does it? Let's change that to squares again. Squares. So it's starting to fill in those gaps, and it's creating new particles as and when we want. So let's just go to the sheeter. And there's loads of settings here which I won't go into now, but basically you can define how big the holes are that can be filled. You can define the angle, so if the particles are moving away from each other at too great an angle, they won't sheet, so you get these more tendril-like sheets. But for our simulation, we just want to fill this up. Okay, and that's kind of looking all right. Let's add a little bit more. So this is going to be super low res and look horrible, but I want it to play in real time. So now we've got this filling up. So this is the technique. And to get the magic that Mario achieved here, we have to use the good old Cinema 4D Boole object. And this is the clever bit. First we need to mesh these particles. So to make a mesh, we've got a generators, OpenVDB mesher. And I want to take the particle emitter and stick it in the source window. Oh, it's not enough. Hang on. There we go. So stick the emitter in there, and it makes this huge blobby mesh. Because we're at low res here with few particles, this isn't going to look like a very detailed splash, but you'll get the idea. So it's meshing those particles, and it's forming this mesh as it fills up this cube. So it kind of looks like it's doing what we want. But the problem is, if I hit ND, the OpenVDB mesher makes these nice quads and makes it as even as possible, but these change on a frame-by-frame basis, and that's not going to work for us when we're rendering with things like refraction and reflections. You're going to see a little bit of flickering, and you're going to see joins, which isn't going to look right. So how do we get around that? Well, this is what we do. We get the Cinema 4D Boole object, which basically joins two objects in different ways. And I'm going to put the OpenVDB mesher first. And instead of the Boolean type A subtract B, I'm going to put A intersect B. And B is going to be my cube. Let's make those particles invisible. And let's make the cube visible. So now what's happening is, as soon as that OpenVDB intersects the cube, it takes on its geometry, it takes on its subdivisions. And the Boole is doing this, which is pretty cool. And as soon as it completely intersects, we just get the Boole. Now, because this is low res, we've still got a bit of a hole in the OpenVDB, so it hasn't completely encapsulated it. But if we had more particles, it would. So that's pretty nice. Now the next step, it'll make it clear exactly what I'm doing here and why it's important to do it like this. So I'm going to go to a different scene. So this is a cached scene because I've done it at a higher resolution so I can show you what it looks like. But instead of the collider object being a static cube, what I've done is I've got my cached and retimed plastic bag as the collision object. It's just invisible at the moment. So watch this. As the particles spread out, they then form in. And this is, I'm not sure how easy that is to see on the screen, but this is our 5. And this is following our plastic bag. Let's just, there you go. So it's following that as the collider object. And then it follows it in. So then when we activate the mesher, there's the splash. And I've purposefully made the mesher bulge out at the end to fill any possible holes. So then when we put that in the bool, mesher in, and we want to put our plastic bag in, not there. Let's just shut that to make it more obvious. So now we have the same principle. Now it's going to run relatively slowly because the bool is having to work pretty hard here, and it's mixing this incredibly dense polygon mesh, and it's joining edges, and it's doing quite a lot under the hood. But this is the splash. Let's take those lines off. And as the splash gets bigger and bigger, turn those off. Hang on, I need to make this visible. Sorry, I'll start that again. So here's the splash. And as the splash hits the plastic bag geo that's cached, it creates the bool, which gives it the right geometry. And this is how we get that animation happening. So now the bag is going to start contracting. There it goes. And it sucks down. And all the geo is perfect. So when you have your transparent glass material on, you're not going to get weird flickering. And a bonus of this technique, which you kind of just get for free, is that you get these internal bubbles happening, the big ones, because that's the VDB mesh moving around inside the volume. And it really, really enhances the look of this moving. So it's pretty cool. It's maybe listening to a presentation, it's a lot to take in, but actually if you re-watch this online when they post the videos and work through this yourself, actually it's relatively simple steps, and it all does make sense, but you get what I think is an amazingly impressive result for actually not much work. If somebody showed me that and said you need to produce this video, I'd say, well give me a month and I'll get it to you. But actually, now you know how to do it, you could recreate it in 3 or 4 days. So it's pretty quick stuff. So what have we got? We've got about 10 minutes left. What can we look at? One of the shots which I really love in this is this. This is my favourite shot, the 3 to the 2. So let's have a look at it. So it's really cool. And again, when I first looked at it, I watched it about 20 times. And I thought, well, as those kind of grain particles, it looks like they're kind of being sucked around it. So has he done some kind of force field to like force them around in this way? And I came up with all these strategies in my mind of how Mario must have created this look. And as usual, he sent me the scene file, and it was the most simple setup I think I've ever seen, actually. So let's just have a look at it. Demo grain. So all we've got here, come out this camera. So this is going to be, there's a gravity object, but the gravity object is pointing in the plus Z, so things aren't falling down, they're falling back. So what we have got is a number 3 piece of geometry, which is spawning these particles, and a colour modifier is giving them this nice gradient on the Z depth. And what XParticles has got for doing sand grain simulations, in the emitter, you're able to emit things in what's called hexagonal emission mode. And what that does, which is really important for grains, is that it looks at the volume of the object that you're emitting from, and it spawns the particles in an hexagonal grid, so there is no intersection whatsoever when they are born. So there is no spare room in this volume whatsoever, because grain solvers and fluid solvers in general don't like intersecting particles. That's when they explode. So hexagonal mode gives us this 3. And what Mario has done, he has got a fluid effects fluid solver in there, which is the same one we used to make the splash. But to make it behave like sand, what you do is you go to the emitter, to the extended data tab. We've got a fluid data section, and you have the fluid type set to granular, so it's going to make sand. And then all he has is an animated gravity object that's got a box fall off. You see this huge box fall off? You'll see that move upwards, so anything that's inside the fall off will be affected by gravity, which is going backwards. Anything that isn't won't. So when they're first born, they're not affected by gravity, and as the fall off passes over them, gravity takes place and the sand crumbles. And I've just put it on this square collider object here. It's just a cube with a collision tag. So that's just our crumbling sand, and low resolution, so it plays smoothly for you. But you can still see we're getting the nice clumps. See, it's clumping and cracking. And all Mario did here, this is the genius bit. Let's switch that cube off. He just has a number 2 piece of geometry underneath the 3 with a collider tag on, and it's slightly set back from the 3. There's the 3 and there's the 2. And as the gravity comes past, they just fall down. That's it. But when you get close up, you get this real impression that they're being kind of almost sucked around the 2, even at this really low resolution. Now, the simple setups are always the best, always. And so you up that res, you get a nice render, and the result is this fabulous sucking round. And then there's a nice extra bit of advection. So what have we managed? We've managed 6 to 5 to 4, and we've run out of time. So what we're going to be doing, obviously my job at INSYDIUM is to make all the training content. And so you might have seen we've got loads of free training on YouTube. If you are an Xparticles maintenance user, so you have a maintenance agreement, you also have access to loads of maintenance tutorials, which are accessed via our website through an account. And these are constantly being added to, so there'll be a huge library of training. So what I intend to do in the near future is to actually do a full project breakdown of this entire thing, all the way from 6 down to 1. Every technique broken down into a big tutorial series. So for more kind of explanations of it, we'll make those available as soon as possible. Right, that's it from me. Thanks very much.